Welcome to the eLABorate Topics podcast, where we focus on lab-specific strategies for medical laboratory professionals. We're proud to be the healthcare detectives that work behind the scenes to get the results needed to influence medical decisions. Let's grow together and jump right into the lab.
Welcome back to another episode of the eLABorate Topics podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts for today's Roundtable alongside my other co-hosts, Lona Small and Tywauna Wilson. Hi, ladies.
Hi.
If you haven't listened before, the eLABorate Topics podcast is a weekly podcast where myself and my two co-hosts bring you weekly messages related to leadership in laboratory to help the listeners excel inside and outside of the laboratory. And today is going to be a very special and exciting and I hope very interesting episode because we're joined by a fellow podcaster, Mr. Dennis Strenk. Hi, Dennis.
Hi. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. I'm excited to talk about our podcast.
Yeah, me too.
So for our listeners, a little bit of background. Dennis has been a certified pathologist assistant since 2003. And is also a histotechnician, certified histotechnician. Since 2018, he has worked at the Wisconsin Diagnostics Laboratory in an academic medical center. From 2009 to 2018, he was the editor-in-chief of the Cutting Edge, the Journal of the American Association of Pathologist Assistants, and served on the Board of Trustees of the AAPA from 2018 to 2020. In 2019, Dennis launched the People of Pathology podcast, in which he interviews people in pathology and laboratory medicine. The People of Pathology podcast is ranked number 2 on the FeedSpot list of 20 pathology podcasts you must follow in 2022. And for our listeners today, we really just wanted to bring Dennis on and have a round table and talk about our experiences of being lab advocates through the mechanism and podcast platform. So I'm going to give Dennis a minute to just tell us a little bit about himself and a little bit about his podcast, The People of Pathology.
Well, sure. Thank you. So, you've covered most of it in the bio. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the way I got into the field because it was non-traditional. So I graduated from college. I had a biology degree, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself. And it took me almost 2 years. I ended up as a lab assistant in a histology department at a hospital here in Milwaukee. Eventually trained to be a histotechnologist. And then from there, I was working with the PA that we had, and she started showing me some grossing things. And I became interested in that. And so I ended up, at that time, you could train to be a PA on the job, which you can't do anymore. But you could train on the job for 3 years, and then you would sit for the same exam that the students from the program trained, from the PA programs went through. So it was the same exam. I got the same certification. And it was an unusual, kind of a difficult way to do it, but I'm glad that I did. And somebody had asked me at some point, like, if I could go back, would I have done it the sort of traditional way? And I don't think so, because then I wouldn't have been a lab assistant and I wouldn't have been a histotech. And I feel like having had those experiences in other lab professions, it helps me now because I can understand it. Like, I feel like I do my job with them in mind, especially the histotechs, because I know, if my sections aren't correct or the right thickness or they don't process correctly, whatever, it makes the job more difficult for them. So that's a little bit about me. And then, like you said in the bio, I've been a certified PA since 2003. And, since 2018, I've been at Wisconsin Diagnostics Laboratories, which has been great. It's, I tell people all the time I see interesting things every single day. And as far as the podcast, that started in December of 2019. And that was just sort of a way for me to, I had a few different ideas of why I wanted to start it, but it was kind of a way for me to learn about other things that people in pathology and lab medicine were doing. And I felt like I could sort of give them a platform to talk about their accomplishments. And that's kind of how it started, and I think it's sort of evolved since then.
Very, very interesting for me. And I worked in histology before, so I find that very interesting. And the fact that for some people who work in the clinical lab, if they have like the lab tech exposure, they tend to be more empathetic towards lab tech. If you worked as a phlebotomist or a processor, you understand the challenges before you move up. And you started out as a doing histology and then moved into PA. So that's really interesting.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're going to roundtable. Seeing that it's really a roundtable, I'm going to probably ask a question, and then maybe Tywauna could ask a question, but we all will get a chance to talk about all of our experiences. I know, we don't have a lot of time, so we'll just talk a little bit on each of the different topics to kind of share our experiences in podcasting. So I think the question is for all of us is, what led you to start a lab podcast? And I'll start with Dennis, and then we can roundtable.
So I was sitting around I was chatting actually with a friend of mine on Twitter. She's a pathologist assistant. Her name is Elise Gray. And we were talking about podcasts because that's kind of how we started talking with each other. We know we had the job in common, and then we also liked a lot of the same podcasts. So we were talking about those, and we realized that we thought anyways, that there weren't any for lab professionals. There weren't any podcasts for us. And she said, or we thought, wouldn't it be great if there was one that kind of highlighted the people in the lab and what they were doing, both inside the lab and outside. And she said, well, I'm writing a book. You should start a podcast, and then you can interview me about my book for practice. So, okay, sure. So I started looking into it, and I realized that it wasn't that hard, and it wasn't that expensive. I mean, it costs a little bit. You had to have, recording software and a hosting platform. I mean, you all know how that goes. And so I figured all these things out, and we kind of got something together, and I came up with some questions, and we did the interview, and the recording sounded terrible because I didn't know what I was doing. And so we did it again, and it sounded a little bit better, but still not great. But so that became the first episode. And from there, it was just a matter of reaching out to people on Twitter and LinkedIn and other things, and I started to realize that there were all these other areas of pathology and lab medicine that I didn't know anything about, especially clinical lab, because coming from the histology kind of side of it, I didn't know much about clinical lab. So I wanted to learn about those things. And then there were other areas of forensics and just, digital pathology and all of those things. And it just it kept getting bigger, and I kept, wanting to explore other areas, some of which were barely related to pathology, but kind of, I guess. So that's how it started for me. It was never like a vehicle for, I didn't want to promote myself. I wanted to promote the other people that maybe didn't get that much recognition, and I thought that they should. So that's kind of why I wanted to start doing it.
Awesome. Anybody else want to jump in?
No, I think Dennis brought up a good point. I mean, just like Dennis in his first episode, we were the exact same way. Like, is this episode any good? Are people going to listen? And I just think, at least for me, getting into this space, because before I was on the eLABorate Topics podcast, I actually had a radio show, a live radio show. And so I understood the impact that a radio show could do for an audience, for a particular organization, for a particular group. And so, thinking on a larger scale, and that was just me doing that at that time, interviewing guests all over the world and understanding that impact, thinking, wow, if we could do this for lab, and we hadn't seen anybody with a laboratory show specifically catered for laboratory professionals. And so we thought, of course, each of us are great in our own right, but together we have something really special. And so I know from my perspective, it was beneficial for us to come together and share our unique talents with the lab community, because a lot of people that listen to our show or are touched or connected to our show are not our typical lab people that's involved with the professional societies, those that are actively engaged on Twitter. Those are not necessarily the people that we touch. We touch those people that maybe came into the lab and maybe had a bad experience, and so they've disconnected from the lab, or they are just not tied into the professional societies, and so they are still trying to figure out if they want to be involved or not. And so understanding that impact and seeing people say, you know what, if it wasn't for your show, I was going to get out of the lab. I appreciate seeing you all's visibility, your honesty, your authenticity. And so for me, that was the reason for us to start the show, because people that were lab professionals hadn't seen voices or heard voices such as ours. And so I think that's why it was kind of important. And it was before even ASCP started their particular podcast. So when we got into it, it wasn't as many podcasts as there is today, but it was definitely a need. And I think we are touching an audience that may otherwise not be touched.
I think that's so true, Tywauna. I think for me, I initially had been connected to Tywauna through a mutual friend. And in the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, I actually reached out to her thinking maybe I could be a guest on her podcast. I didn't know it was going to turn into all of this. But for me, it was just a way to maybe get out information. I just didn't see a central way for people that I knew that were struggling the same way that I was during the pandemic, trying to get information out to their staff, trying to keep up with the newest information, to share that. And I felt like the only way that we were going to make it through the pandemic, which we're still making it through the pandemic, but I feel like really the only way that we were going to make it through as a profession and as colleagues is to be able to share and connect and collaborate as much as possible. And I just didn't see a central way to do that. I remember as we were going through the early months of the pandemic, I had like a notebook where I was writing down different things that I was successful at, how I was able to get different supplies in when suppliers were short, and how I was able to do things to immediately communicate changes from the CDC out to my staff. And I just had this list of things that I felt like other lab directors should know, but there's not like a defined listserv or, central, like I said, central location to just communicate those things. So like I said, after reaching out to Tywauna, it seemed like with myself, Tywauna, and Lona, and all of our specialties, we had enough, content to really continuously share with a particular audience. And I think one of the things that has been really amazing is to hear the feedback. I think when you're on LinkedIn, it's great, but a lot of people treat LinkedIn a little bit like Facebook. You kind of just scroll through and see the different articles you like and press like or celebrate. But I, at least personally, wasn't making as many connections as I think I could. And some people even seemed a little untouchable to me, like they were so high or making such an impact that I really shouldn't reach out to them. And I think that connecting through podcasting has helped break down some of those walls for me and just realize that we're all in this space and in this laboratory medicine thing trying to help each other out and do the best we can for the patients that we serve. So that's my reason.
Awesome. And mine, I think, we have similar reasons, but they're kind of slightly different because I kind of started out with this vision where I wanted to help lab leaders because I wanted to us to kind of see the value of the lab in that big picture. I'm into patient safety and, big picture thinking, like how does the lab fit in to that big picture of patient care? And so I started doing a lot of videos on that. And I started thinking that if I could get leaders to realize, maybe starting from the ground up, starting in the basement, on doing things to change the culture of the lab so that we can move into that bigger picture, that C-suite. So I started doing a lot of video and training and other things, and I was doing some things, putting on YouTube and LinkedIn. And while I was on LinkedIn, I saw this lady. I came across these podcasts, and she would put it on LinkedIn, and you get to listen to the full podcast, and that was Tywauna. And she was doing some things on leadership. And I thought, wow, because, I said, let me reach out to her. And I had some mentors that were telling me to start a podcast. So, I reached out to Tywauna. We started talking and, talking about the things that some of my aspiration, what some of the things she was doing. And I told her that I wanted to start a podcast, and she said, go for it. And I'm like, I wanted to start a lab podcast, and she was like, okay, go for it. And then I think she checked on me. We reconnected, and she's like, how is that podcast going? And I'm like, I haven't started yet. So I was that struggling perfectionist. I got the app, the free app on the phone. I practiced. I got all the different equipment. I bought the course, but I never started the podcast. And I remember, like, a few months later, Tywauna sent out this message to a group of us and said, I want to start a lab podcast. Want us to collaborate in starting a lab podcast. And most of the people who she reached out to said they were busy, they were doing other things, and I'm like, okay. But I was a little hesitant because I wanted to start my podcast. So I said, what if I still start my podcast? She's like, you can still do your podcast, but let's start this lab podcast. You can share on both platforms. And then that didn't work out. And then a few months later, she said, I got somebody else because the others didn't. And here was Stephanie. And, we made it happen because Tywauna is that type of person. When she's ready to do something, she does it. And I was that struggling perfectionist, and my podcast never get off the ground. And I'm glad that I, collaborated with Stephanie and Tywauna, and the rest is history.
See, that's interesting because I feel like all of us have slightly different versions of the same reason for doing it. But a couple of days ago, I went back and I listened to your very first episode, and something that you had that I didn't. You had a very defined vision and kind of purpose of what you were trying to do, as far as like what that podcast was for, which I didn't. I kind of found that later on. But you were talking about, advocating for lab professions, but also you wanted to do a lot with leadership, and you mentioned, and you've covered this a lot, the soft skills, which I think are very important and not talked about nearly enough. So that I find that really interesting that you had it very defined right from the beginning.
Yes, we were passionate about leadership. We all were passionate about leadership. So, I think it was a good synergy for all three of us.
Absolutely. And I know for us, we were fortunate enough to just celebrate our 100th episode maybe 2 weeks ago, but we've learned a lot over this journey. And I'm interested to hear, Dennis, what have you learned since starting your podcast? And I know you have a lot of episodes as well, but what have you learned that maybe you didn't expect being on this journey?
Okay. Well, first, congratulations on the 100 episodes. That's amazing. That's an amazing accomplishment. So you should all be proud of that. As far as what I've learned I feel like there's two different answers to that question, because there's things that I learned about all the different lab professions from talking to the people in them, but there's also things that I learned about myself. So as far as the lab professions, I mean, I learned a lot about clinical lab. Like I said earlier, I didn't know very much about it, and I feel like I have a much better understanding and respect for what you do in the clinical lab, especially now, through the pandemic. So that's part of it. I've learned a lot of that. I've learned a lot about different areas of forensic pathology and forensic science that I didn't know existed. And there's all these, lots of times I'll interview somebody and they'll talk about something and I'll say, if I had heard about that when I was getting out of high school or getting out of college, that's probably the field I would have gone into. I talked just today to someone like that. So I've learned so much, and I keep learning about these different fields, which is why I keep doing this, I think. But then also, like just myself personally, I've noticed over the last 2 years that I used to be really kind of shy, and I wasn't the person that was going to go and talk to a stranger. But now that's what I do. I mean, that's what a podcast is, right? Most of these people I've never talked to before. I've just met, either by email or social media or whatever, but it'd be the first time that I'd be talking with them. And it still makes me nervous, but I become much more comfortable with it, to the point that now when I go to a live conference, I can talk to people that I don't know. I can talk to strangers now, and it's still a bit nerve-wracking, but it's much different than it used to be. So I feel like I've grown in that way. I feel like I've become a better just speaker, which was also part of the reason I wanted to start the podcast as well, because I didn't feel like, as far as public speaking, I didn't feel like I did it very well. So now I feel like I just started to get a little better at that. So there's all these different things that I feel like I've learned, and I've kind of grown just myself from learning about the experiences of other people, and that's been really, really rewarding for me.
Yeah, I think for me too, that has been one of the biggest things that I've learned through podcasting is just so many intricacies about myself. I used to be the one. Have you ever been to like a meeting where they try to do the icebreaker, where they're like, "Hey, tell us something interesting about yourself"? And that would just give me so much. That gave me so much anxiety, because I'm like, I don't have anything. I just recently went to an ASCP meeting earlier this year. One of the icebreakers was to, put out 2 truths and a lie about yourself. And I'm just bad at that type of stuff. I just am. And I say that because I never previously really thought anything I did was extraordinary or more impactful than any other laboratory medicine director, or more important or more interesting. I think I thought that we were all the same caliber, and I was, average like everybody else. But what I have learned is that what everybody is bringing something to the table, and everybody has something to teach you that you may not have known before, and everybody is an expert in something. And if you talk to them long enough, you can really find out what those things are. And so I've learned a lot about myself, just like Dennis, going to these conferences. I feel much more confident not only talking to people, but I'm prouder of the things that I've done, only because, from podcasting, I've been able to network with many people who are in the laboratory medicine and really early in their career journey, who want to seek my help to try to move up, or at least try to understand opportunities within this laboratory medicine profession. And the fact that they seek help from me makes me feel like a little bit more legit, in what I'm doing. Also, I've realized that there's just not enough people volunteering or using their voice. You do see the same laboratory people kind of recycled for different blogs, interviews, articles, podcast episodes and things like that. And so whenever I mentor people, I always say ASCP, ASCLS, AABB, everybody needs your voice, because everybody, like I said, is offering something to the table. And I think most significantly is that, you know, when we started and we said we wanted to do a laboratory podcast about laboratory stuff, that it's not just technical stuff. There's a lot of other subjects that aren't necessarily brought by laboratorians that impact us or that can be interesting to us. You know, I've done interviews with people talking about the concept of, you know, the second victim, and how blood bank technologists, although they're not right there in the trauma room doing resuscitations on a patient, because they're preparing blood, you know, they feel as connected to that case, you know, and whatever outcome there is, and can be traumatized by the death of a patient, by any transitions that patients make, just like a nurse or a physician can. We've done conversations on deep HR issues. We've done conversations about work friends. And, you know, these are common subjects that anybody would, you know, benefit from. So what I've learned is that our listeners like the practicality of our podcast. They like, you know, when in the beginning, I felt like I had messed up too much or stumbled over my words. And what I realized is that people like the practicality and the realness of hearing an actual lab person who works a 9 to 5, you know, record themselves. Like, it actually made people feel more comfortable that I had made a mistake during the recording, because it made me sound like a real person who made a mistake. So I think that's what I've learned. What about the rest of you?
Yes, well, Stephanie, and I think Dennis, both of you talk about networking. I use the word collaboration. I think that I realize how huge. I mean, I knew that before, but it's more like a validation that collaboration is really huge and it works. So with us collaborating on this, it made a difference for me, because when I started out, I had a lot of hesitation, like, okay, I have all these other things that I have to do, you know, in terms of how long would this be. I didn't know how long I'd be doing this for, but just doing it together with Tywauna and Stephanie makes a difference. So it actually works. And another thing is that what I learned is that you don't have to meet someone in person to have great connection. Because I still haven't met Tywauna and Stephanie. They kind of got it over me because they recently met each other in person. So that's one thing I learned. And then another thing that I've learned a lot, that you can start small and then, you know, to get to where because when we started out, I suppose it was mentally or in terms of how we thought about this was maybe for me, you can start small and then it can lead to big things. Another thing is that there's somebody out there that needs your message. And I figured that out afterwards based on the feedback that we get. You know, a lot of people are listening that may not put a comment. We may say go to Direct Impact Broadcasting and put your comment or feedback, and we never see that then. But eventually we'll hear about, oh, I listened to your podcast. Oh, I learned this from your podcast. And like recently, I have a coaching community, and we just did a graduation, and they were kind of giving their experience. And a lot of them said it was because they listened to me on the podcast. They saw what I valued just by listening to me, and understanding all three of us how positive we were when it comes to the field of medical lab. It gave them hope, and it made them want to say, I'd want to learn more from you. So a lot of times we may not realize the impact and the lives that we're touching, but I think that's something that I learned, that somebody needs your message, and be that light when things may seem challenging, especially during COVID. And I think I learned a lot. It's okay to talk about things that others are not talking about. Like Stephanie said, we talk about self-care. We talk about things like team culture. I mean, for me, I talk a lot about building team culture, utilizing your team strength, stepping up and stepping out as a profession, because a lot of people are like so discontented and ready to give up, and it's like talking about that is really helpful. That's not what a lot of people are talking about. And also you build your personal brand from consistent message, and I think that came out from my next level coaching, just having that consistent message build that brand. And we all need a Tywauna and a Stephanie in our lives. Those are what I've learned about.
I love it. That's great.
Well,
Yeah,
Dennis, go ahead, Tywauna, sorry.
Yeah, I just got a few things. You all had a lot of great stuff, but I agree. You get to meet people virtually even that you've never met before. And outside of everything that you all talked about, I kind of look at it, too, as an opportunity to give, right? And so we all, as I heard you all's message, you want to give back. You want to be able to allow others to hear a message, or you learn something and you want to share that with others. And I think that's what makes these podcasts so successful, is that as leaders of them, we have that heart of service where we want to give. And when you give, you get, right? Not that you do it to get, but you do get. So whether it's those connections, whether it's those friendships or those new relationships, you get in return as you're meeting people, collaborating with people, and then doors open up. So whether you're doing it as just a total give back, or you're doing it to build a brand, or whatever the case may be, it still goes back to being, for you, starting with a heart of service to give. And I think that's what our listeners for both shows take away, is that they can hear our heart of service.
Yep. I know you all can't see me, but I'm just sitting here nodding my head to everything you're saying. Yep.
Dennis, I'm curious,
sorry,
because for the listener, no worries. For the listeners who may not have heard of your podcast and then go like right now to your platform and want to listen, where should they start? I mean, you said you've learned so much and talked to so many people in the laboratory medicine field. So what are some of your favorites or your most memorable ones, or the ones you feel like were most listened to? I think some of the ones that were most listened to us, we were kind of surprised that those were the ones that the audience kind of latched onto. But what are your thoughts about some of your episodes?
This is a tough one, because I don't know if you feel the same. Like every episode, I feel like, at that time, that's my favorite one. Does that make sense? But
it does.
Yeah. But I think for me, a lot of the forensic science and forensic pathology episodes are probably the most popular. I think it's just an interesting topic for a lot of people. But there's a few. I tried to make a short list, and it's not very short, but I'll try to cut it down. Episode 4 for me, so it was Dr. Judy Melanik and her husband T.J. Mitchell, who's a writer, and they had just published their second book at the time, and so I was fairly new. It was episode 4. I think at the time I contacted them, I had 2 episodes out. So I did a whole lot of research on them, and I read both of their books, and I took a lot of notes and all this stuff. And that one is memorable for me because of all of the work that I put in to do it, and I think it showed in the episode. And that was the first time that I thought, okay, I think I can really do this for a long term. So there was that one. There was Dr. Rodney Rohde, who's been on twice. He's just a super interesting guy to talk to. Dr. Nicole Jackson, I know you've had her on your show as well. She's super interesting. I had her on. I kept in touch with her, and then I went to a conference in the city where she lives, and I actually got to meet her and have dinner with her in person, which was really cool. So that kind of goes back to what you were all talking about before, about making the connections and friendships and things like that. Dana Baker, she was really interesting, and her story, just kind of her background is really interesting, because I related to it, because it was sort of she found the field by accident. She said she was like paging through a course catalog or something like that and just happened upon the clinical laboratory science. Of course, I have to mention Lona Small. That was a really fun one to talk with you, Lona. Another really important one. Another really important one, though, was Dr. Carla Ellis. She's the president. She's a pathologist. She's the president of the Society of Black Pathologists. And this was a really interesting conversation. We were talking about race and race in medicine and her sort of experiences coming up, through her education and having to deal with some of those things. And it was really sort of honest discussion. I was very I was honored that she would tell me these stories and then I could kind of have this discussion with her kind of in the middle of all of the things that were happening and are still happening with regard to race. And then Dr. Michael Williams is another one. He's got a podcast called Diversify and Path, which everybody should also listen to. But it was the same kind of thing. These are the kind of topics that he talks about on every episode of his podcast. So I got to talk with him about that. And then he had me on his show as well, kind of giving my perspective on my experience, or I guess it was lack of experience with those things. Jim Payne, that one was really cool. I know you've had him as well. Just what he's doing with his high school students, and I was so amazed and so impressed with the work that he's doing. I mean, everybody talks about the staffing shortages and what to do about it, and he is literally helping to fix the problem. And I think his program should be duplicated and made available everywhere because it's working. And it's, I know he's involved with some committees with ASCP now. I think with you, Tywauna, as well, and I think it's with Dr. Rhodey also on the same, I forget the name of the committee, but he's involved with that, and I think that's great. So, I mean, there's a lot more I could go on, but those are some of the, I think, kind of the most memorable ones for me.
Awesome.
What about you, ladies?
I think for me, the most memorable one was the first episode. We went on. I mean, Lona was the expert. We were like, for me, I was so much in my head, like trying to do the right thing, say the right thing, do the right, the way you should present. And at the end of it, I felt terrible. I thought that it was a mess. We were like really beating ourselves, me and Stephanie, beating ourselves up. It was hard. It's like you plan a wedding to go perfect and you're seeing everything that went wrong, but then the guests don't see it. That's how that one was. So I found that one to be one of the most memorable. Another one that was most memorable to me was my first interview, and that was with Carla Ellis. And, of course, I messed up with that too, but I really loved the message that was brought to the audience because, for me, it's like the lab should have the seat at the healthcare table. So that opportunity for having, like, that doctor in clinical lab science, I just wanted to bring Carlo on. At the time he had just started his training to talk about that experience, and that was memorable to me. And my first solo podcast. So I suppose all the first ones were memorable because of the experience. So my first solo podcast was, I think it was the third episode, and it was Leading Changes in Crisis, using care to sustain changes in crisis. And it was like at the very beginning of the pandemic, and I thought that was so relevant at the time. A lot of people were not talking about leading through crisis, and I thought that was very important to talk about, especially in the lab. And so I used the acronym Communicate, Be Aware, Be a Role Model, and to Encourage. And so I enjoyed doing that episode, even though that was my first solo episode. And so those three first were my most memorable episodes. I know there were a lot of other great episodes that we did, and I love the ones that have to do with team culture, because that's what I'm into, like empowering your team, to reduce burnout. That was very relevant, the positive effect of challenging your team, and everything that has to do with team culture. I enjoyed those. How about you, ladies?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of memorable episodes. Anytime we have a guest on, and Dennis talked a lot about some of the guests that he's had, and those are some of the same guests that we've had as well that I've definitely enjoyed. Of course, the interviews with guests, but then also some of just the practical career kind of interviews. So when I look at some of our statistics and look at what our guests really enjoy, what I find is that our listeners really like interviews or shows around landing their dream job, or making confident decisions in the lab, or your single most important soft skill, or ways to grow. Like those episodes that we have done either roundtable style or with a guest, it seems to be the ones that are around communication and leadership and building your career are the ones that have the most downloads. We've talked about a lot of different stuff, and some of them that I think were probably more impactful, but they may not have been downloaded as much. So it seems to be people are really caring about, should I stay in this lab or should I go? Everybody else is leaving to go be travelers. Should I stay here or should I go? And we talked about that on an episode. And then it's always interesting talking to some of our international scientists. And so we've had several international laboratorians that have their ASCPI designation. So talking with them and understanding the challenges that they have had in their countries. And so I'm like Dennis, every episode that comes out is the favorite until the next week. and then we get another guest. But I know that our time is limited here, but my favorites go back to our 100th episode anniversary, and a lot of my favorites are included there.
I agree. My favorites are all in the 100th episode. Just like Dennis said, I enjoy talking to Jim Payne because he knew our podcast better than I did. I mean, he was naming Tywaana's book. It made me feel bad. I called Tywaana and I said, "What's the name of your book again?" Jim is the official fourth member. Jim and also Aaron Odegaard. He has been an amazing supporter, and we've had him on the show too. I think my favorite ones are the ones where I can get so deep into the conversation that I don't even remember that we're recording. And those are the ones that I feel like, have had like the most intricate data. We had one about cap inspections, virtual cap inspections. And it was at a time where I was actually preparing for our first virtual cap inspection. And so I just poured out all kinds of information. We've had one talk about how to lead when your boss can't lead, or you perceive that your boss can't lead. And, I've had a lot of bad bosses. I hope they're not listening right now. Because if you are listening, you're not the one. It was the other one. But if you go back to the 100th episode, I've got a lot listed in there. So Lona has here, I think, for one of the last questions, Dennis, for you is, what is your next level dream for your podcast? Where do you hope to see? You've done so much. You're on the top list for laboratory podcasts to listen to in 2022. Where can you go from here, or where do you hope to go from here?
I mean, of course it would be great to get, sponsors and get paid to do this, and have it become sort of a job, I guess. But it's not going to happen. I mean, there's not that much. it's a niche sort of field, so it's not that big of a listenership that would get that kind of sponsorship opportunities. But one of the things is eventually in the future, the thing I've been playing around with is how to start like scholarships. So people talk a lot about, like we said before, the workforce shortage, and then how to get people into the field. And some of it is just exposure to the field, and some of it is just having the kind of financial resources to be able to do it. So if I could find out or figure out a way to start scholarships, like, I mean, of course, I would start with AAPA because that's where I come from, the pathologist assistants, some kind of scholarship for them to get into for somebody to get into a program. But eventually, ASCLS, ASCP, even the Society of Black Pathologists, I know they're talking about doing that for themselves and to be able to collaborate with them maybe. And there's other organizations in the UK. I've talked with some people, part of them, and something like that. But to give back to the lab community in that sort of way, and I don't know how I would do that yet, but that would be kind of the ultimate dream, to be able to do something like that. But like we said earlier, I mean, just doing a podcast and kind of being sort of, I guess, one of the many voices out there advocating for the field has provided me with a lot of other opportunities to do things. In fact, the fact that I'm sitting here talking with the three of you today is one of those opportunities. But I've been asked to speak. I've been on other podcasts. I've been, I'm collaborating with someone in Turkey. We're writing an article together about, they're called macroscopic technicians in Turkey, which is the kind of their version of the pathologist assistant. So we're writing an article together about that, and that came from her being on my podcast. So it's opportunities like that come up just by doing this thing and by talking to other people, and that, that's not going to replace my day job ever, but it's fun to be involved in all these other things, and to meet, interesting people while doing that. So I really enjoy that.
Do you find it hard to say no to anything?
Yes, I do, and because everything sounds so interesting, and it's like, all right, well, I don't have the time for this, but I have to somehow fit it in because it sounds like a great opportunity. And then you can kind of get over your head real quick.
Yeah, I heard everybody giggling on that question because we probably all.
Yeah, I like that question, Stephanie, because I think even with the podcast, with the growth of this podcast, at one point I was kind of scared that I was biting off more than I could chew. And, but now when you realize the impact that it has, for me, I have big dreams for this podcast because I'm seeing that if we can have exponential growth to reach a larger and a broader global audience, we'll really be making a big difference. And I think I think we generally have the same dream among three of us, but I'm not sure. I mean, the way I express mine may be a little different. But I think that collaboration is such a powerful tool, like just with us collaborating on our own, but I think that expanding that collaboration, and today's a great example with us collaborating with Dennis from People of Pathology podcast, and even collaborating on different different lab media platforms. I think we're hoping that we can be on different platforms so we can grow and reach more audience. So I did a webinar, which is kind of on demand. I'm not sure if it's out there yet, with CLMA, and it says Collaboration, the most important practice to solve challenges facing medical laboratory. So I think that for us, if we use that as a tool that would be great for our podcast. That's just my personal. I don't know what Tywauna and Stephanie think.
No, I agree with you. I think collaboration is good, and, you never know. You never know what audience you can impact. Dennis said it may not be enough to quit your day job. I'm a dreamer. You never know. You never know who's listening, and you never know how that vision might be able to be realized. It makes me think of one of our guests, Tiffany Lab Lady Gill, and I mean, if you know her, you know she's big on YouTube and very passionate about what she does. She has tons and tons of followers on YouTube. But one of the things she's very passionate about is educating her students. And so she had this big idea to create a sale bowl. And she was able to partner with ASCP and some other lab professionals in this endeavor and had over 75 programs to be a part of that endeavor. And so they were able to give a giveaway to the winners, to the winning team. They were able to get membership and some other things from ASCP. And so, you never know. I think there's opportunities for sponsorship. It just might look a little different than what you might initially visualize. But, yeah, I absolutely agree with you all with everything that you said. So I know that our time is almost coming to a close, but I want our listeners to be able to get and stay connected with Dennis. So how can they follow you and get connected with you and support you? So if, maybe it could be somebody that's listening on this podcast to say, you know what, I like that scholarship idea. How can I help? I'm interested. I don't want to go on the air. I don't want to use my voice, but maybe they want to use their treasure. And so how can people get connected with you and support you in some of your ideas?
Okay, well, I mean, you're listening to a podcast right now. Whatever podcast player you're using, you can search for People of Pathology podcast, and you'll find me there. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. The handle is @PeopleOfPath. And I'm probably most active on LinkedIn these days, and that's just under my name, Dennis Strenk. So you can find me there as well. Also, if you do have and you want to get involved with the scholarship idea, you can send me an email. So that's peopleofpathology@gmail.com. And those are all the ways you can find me.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Thanks so much, Dennis Strenk from People of Pathology podcast, to grace us with your presence and to talk to us about how we learn from podcasting, some of the lessons we've learned, some of the great experiences and the impact of podcasting, especially lab podcasting. So I really enjoyed our talk. I think we had an amazing time, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun, and it's a great honor to be here and to be talking with fellow podcasters and lab professionals. So thank you.
And thank you, wonderful guests, for tuning in to another episode of eLABorate Topics podcast. We always love to serve you, and we also would like to feature you. So share any of your favorite takeaways from today's episode or any other episode from the season. Go on to directimpactbroadcasting.com, and you'll see a link so you can do a video review. So you can listen to this and other episodes on directimpactbroadcasting.com or any of your favorite podcast platforms. And don't forget to subscribe. If you subscribe, you can always be reminded of any episode that's coming up. And leave your comments on directimpactbroadcasting.com. And also join our eLABorate Topics group on LinkedIn. And so thank you so much. If you want to be a guest on the show, you can also find a guest interest form on directimpactbroadcasting.com or email us at elaboratetopics@directimpactbroadcasting.com. broadcasting.com. So thank you so much. Please tune in next week to hear another amazing episode of Direct Impact of eLABorate Topics podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of eLABorate Topics, where your hosts discussed relevant strategies for laboratory professionals. Please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and listen to us on directimpactbroadcasting.com. Stay tuned for another episode with information you can use to excel in your laboratory career.